Happening now in Ottawa, the Task Force on Services to Canadians is providing an update on its work to improve the delivery of government services and reduce wait times. Let's listen.
Caused a backlog and serious delays in the processing of passport applications by the federal government.
The surge in travel has also put an enormous strain on the air industry, which is struggling with staff shortages due to the pandemic. The result has been a significant number of delayed as well as canceled flights, lost luggage, and significant inconvenience and stress to air travelers worldwide. This is not, and I repeat, this is not a Canadian phenomenon. Other countries are experiencing similar delays and similar problems. Immigration is another example. Canada had to adjust to international travel restrictions, border closures, reduced processing capacity, and the inability of applicants to obtain and submit documentation to keep welcoming newcomers during the pandemic. However, responding to humanitarian crises and updating aging technology to meet demands have led to processing delays and backlogs of older applications in IRCC's inventories. IRCC has been working very, very hard to clear these backlogs while continuing to process new applications. The Prime Minister created the Task Force for Services to Canadians in June to urgently improve these government services with a focus on reducing wait times for Canadians. The task force has been meeting regularly over the summer to review service delivery, identify gaps and areas for improvement, and make recommendations to Cabinet. In each of these portfolios, ministers are implementing short as well as longer-term solutions that will reduce wait times, clear inventories, and ensure Canadians from coast to coast to coast that they receive the highest quality of service. J'invite maintenant mon collègue, le ministre Miller.
I will now ask my colleague, Minister Miller, to give an overview of the progress achieved so far by the task force.
Thanks, Marcy.
The delays we've seen for immigration applications, passport processing, and at airports are indeed unacceptable. Canadians deserve high-quality and efficient government services that are accessible, timely, and make their lives easier, not harder. As Minister Ian explained, our government is examining and implementing every possible option to expedite and improve the delivery of services that Canadians rely on every day. And each department has taken a number of actions to address these delays.
The events this spring and early summer that, let's be clear, should never have happened in the first place. Processing staff were hired to expedite immigration applications, and steps were taken to digitize applications, for example, and implement technology-based solutions. Officers were hired to speed up the processing, and triage systems were implemented at passport offices, for example, to help prioritize urgent travel. We're also developing solutions to modernize and streamline the passport program, both over the medium and the long term. For example, to reduce travel delays, Minister Alghabra and Transport Canada worked with Canadian Air Transport Security Authority to hire more screening officers, and they're working closely with airports and air carriers and other air industry partners to ensure efficient travel for passengers.
I want to assure Canadians that we are treating these delays for immigration, passports, and at airports with the greatest sense of urgency and will continue taking steps towards greater improvements. We know there is more to be done. My colleagues and our whole government will continue to work around the clock to address these issues and to prevent them from reoccurring in the future.
Ministers involved. I do want to say that nobody should be congratulating themselves for having done their jobs. We are by no stretch of the imagination out of the woods yet. The focus will continue to be on Canadians and the results they expect and deserve from this or any other government. I now turn the mic over to Minister Gould and the other ministers. Karina.
Great. Thank you, Minister Miller. I am speaking to you from Burlington, which is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Adirondack, and the Mississaugas of the Credit.
I'm happy to discuss the measures taken so far to solve the passport and immigration issues. Passport is more than a travel document.
Canadian citizenship and a chance to reconnect with loved ones, to explore, and to relax. We know that Canadians have faced unacceptable delays this summer in receiving their passports. And we know that this has been coupled with uncertainty, stress, and anxiety. And I take that very seriously. I acknowledge that the recent demand for passports far exceeded the government's expectations. Even
though we were expecting an increased volume, the incredible increase surpassed our expectations. I am fully aware of the undesirable consequences for Canadians. That's why I have asked public servants to pull out all stops to respond to this crisis. And our public servants responded. Across the country, they worked day and night to fill passport applications.
The country this summer to meet with frontline staff. I witnessed the extraordinary work that is being done round the clock to improve passport services to Canadians. We have increased the number of staff serving Canadians in the passport program. In July 2021, our operational workforce had a total of about 1,200 employees, and at the end of July 2022, we had a total of more than 1,900. That represents an increase of 62%. And this additional workforce does a range of work to help deliver passports, including processing passport applications, as well as performing clerical work at mail processing sites. Employees with passport experience who had been doing other work have also been reassigned to support processing, and we are continuing to hire. A triage system has also been implemented in metropolitan areas to manage lineups and ensure that Canadians with upcoming or urgent travel requirements receive their passport in time. These measures are working. Despite the lineups we still see in some places, 96% of the applications made in person at a specialized passport office received this year were issued within the 10-day standard. Overall, 65% of all passport applications received were processed within the service standard. But inside that average, there's still a gap that we must fill. The majority of applications are still received by mail or dropped off at a regular Service Canada centre, and only 40% of those were issued within the 20-day business standard. These numbers fluctuate weekly, but I want you to know that addressing this challenge is the job we are focused on right now. The
hard work of Service Canada personnel has brought results. More than 850,000 passports have been issued since spring. We've improved our wait times at call centers thanks to our employees and technological advances. We've gone from 108 minutes delay in April to 24 in now.
Can have a better experience at passport offices. We have made passport services more accessible to more Canadians closer to where they live. Pickup services are now available at 34 passport offices, as well as 4 Service Canada centres. And we will continue to add more Service Canada centres across Canada to this list in the coming weeks. It is now possible for Canadians to visit any of over 300 Service Canada centres to request a transfer of their passport application if they need it for upcoming travel within 20 days. We have added processing hubs across the country, and the simplified renewal method was expanded to include adults who have had a passport issued in the last 15 years.
We also broadened the issue of passports in 24 sites in Canada. All these measures together have allowed us to improve the situation.
Work to be done. That is why we will continue to do everything necessary to bring service standards back to normal and ensure Canadians can receive their passports in a timely manner. We will take every measure we can to make the experience better for Canadians and make our services more accessible. Thank you. Merci.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Minister Gould. Bonjour à tous. First,
Hello,
I'd like
all.
to acknowledge that I am joining you today virtually from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I want to start off by saying that the delays we've been seeing at airports are frustratingly unacceptable. Les délais sont inacceptables.
These delays are
I
unacceptable.
also want to be clear that we won't stop working until this issue is resolved. As you know, our air sector has seen a massive increase in traffic. Between January and August, the number of air travelers jumped by more than 250%, and they continue to climb. What's more, these numbers have climbed while the aviation industry around the world continues to struggle with staffing up in a challenging labor market. But I want to be clear, none of these are excuses, but if we want to focus on fixing the challenges, we have to understand them properly. So from day one, we took action. On a pris des actions depuis le début.
We took action from day
One way
one.
we're doing this is by making sure the many different partners in the air travel system are working with each other in finding solutions. Each player, Transport Canada, CATSA, CBSA, NAV Canada, airports, airlines, and many more, has an important role in keeping air passengers moving. Their interdependence means that issues in any one area affects other areas in the system. That's why we've been working with airlines, airports, and government agencies every single week to remove bottlenecks and speed up the process for passengers. We've hired 1,800 new security screening officers for airports across the country since April. We've eased and streamlined onboarding processes at airports, like allowing new screening officers to work while training and tripling the number of security clearances issued over the last year to make sure new employees can start as soon as possible. I've personally been meeting with airports and airlines of all sizes across the country every single week to ensure everyone does their part to solve this issue for Canadians. And while we're not there where we want to be, we've seen significant improvements in recent weeks. On a vu des améliorations.
We have seen improvements.
We're moving closer and closer to pre-pandemic numbers. Travelers are spending less time in security screening.
Passengers are spending less time at security screening stations.
Passengers are being screened within 15 minutes. And the number of passengers waiting in aircraft being held on the tarmac at Pearson is also down to 2%. That's from 18% in July. There are also fewer passengers that are facing flight cancellations, with 98% of flights being completed, the same as pre-pandemic levels in 2019. Il y a moins d'annulations. There has also been significant improvement in baggage handling, with some major airlines reporting they are now at the same success rates of baggage handling as 2019 levels. Things are moving in the right direction, but we know that there are still issues. Il reste des enjeux.
There are still
And that
issues.
includes unacceptable situations like passengers sleeping on the floors in airports. C'est inacceptable.
This is
Our
unacceptable.
government is the first in our country's history to have put in place regulations to protect air travelers. On a mis en place un
We
règlement sur la
set up
protection des
air
passagers
passenger
aériens.
protection regulations.
These air passenger protection regulations currently outline compensation requirements when flights are delayed or canceled for reasons within an airline's control. This includes crew shortages if the airline could have prevented the flight disruption with proper planning. We are clear. Airlines must respect travelers' rights and compensate travelers for a delayed or canceled flight if they are eligible. Les compagnies aériennes doivent
Airlines
respecter le
must
droit de
respect
voyager.
passengers' rights.
The Canadian Transportation Agency, or CTA, is our country's independent transportation sector regulator with the powers of a court to enforce these rules. Like any tribunal, the CTA assesses complaints from travelers who believe they are entitled to compensation in instances where airlines have not provided it. Our government has also recently given the CTA an additional $11 million to help them. And we are going to make sure the CTA has the resources they need to fulfill their mandate. On September 8th, changes to the regulations will take effect. These changes will ensure that passengers are offered the option of a refund for flights that are canceled or subject to a lengthy delay for reasons outside of air carriers' control. These include major weather events or a pandemic. Finally, I'd like to thank the frontline aviation workers who have worked hard to reduce delays over the last few weeks and who have been working tirelessly for the last 2 years. I also want to stress that our government is working around the clock with its partners to further reduce wait times and make air travel more efficient. We know there's more work to do, and we are up to the challenge. Thank you, merci. And now I'd like to pass on the mic to Minister Fraser.
Thank you so much, Minister Alghabra. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to begin by joining you here from Treaty 9 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Ojibwe, Chippewa, Mushkegowuk, Algonquin, and Métis peoples. I'd like to start by just discussing a little bit of the importance of immigration to Canada. It's critically important for our country's economy. For those who may not be aware, nearly 100% of our recent labor force growth has been driven by immigration in recent years. When our immigration system is working well, our economy experiences long-term benefits, like tackling our demographic challenges and supporting the stable, reliable social programs that we've come to expect as Canadians. Just to put this into perspective, if we rewind the clock about 50 years, there were 7 workers for every retiree in Canada. Today, that number is closer to 3. And 20, 30 years from now on our current trajectory, that number may be closer to 2 if we don't continue to embrace immigration to grow Canada's population to correct this troubling demographic trend. Although Canada's leading population growth across the G7, we're still seeing an enormous surge in demand for skilled workers in particular. And our country has amongst the greatest quality of life that any nation in the world can offer. There are incredible opportunities here for anyone who works hard. We've got engaged citizens and communities who celebrate our multiculturalism and diversity and who work to support inclusion and make others feel welcome. For a lot of people, Canada is the top destination of choice for hundreds of thousands that come here from all over the world. Though we have a welcoming nature towards newcomers, our immigration system has faced unprecedented challenges and obstacles that have become larger and have compounded upon one another over the past few years.
We were able to adjust our activities to adapt to the pandemic. However, we updated aging technology and had to face successive humanitarian crises in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, which forced us to prioritize certain applications. As we went through the pandemic, the number of applications for visitor visas, study permits, and work permits, as well as permanent residency and citizenship, rose considerably. We're facing many challenges at the same time to support our economy, make family reunifications easier, and fulfill our humanitarian commitments towards people fleeing war and oppression.
We took action to reduce our backlog and get workers to Canada, initially by committing to an $85 million investment to expand digital platforms and services, but also to increase staffing levels. In fact, just last week, I was able to announce that by the end of this fall, we will have added more than 1,250 new staff to increase our processing capacity at IRCC. Some of our new improvements are already increasing efficiency, with more coming to make processes more sustainable and efficient in the long term as well. Some of the investments, that we're working on have reduced wait times in certain critical areas. We have now come back to the pre-pandemic service standard in a couple key streams that people used to come to Canada. Perhaps most notably are the family reunification pathways for spouses and children, which is back to the 12-month standard now that we had pre-pandemic. Similarly, as a result of decisions that were taken to pause intake through the express entry system for economic migrants who come through this key federal streams, we are now back as of July 6th to a pre-pandemic service standard of 6 months that a person can expect to have their application completed in. Similarly, when it comes to permanent residence cards, we have also returned to the pre-pandemic service standard.
Moreover, we're well on our way to reaching our target of 431,000 permanent residency admissions by year end.
We've now finalized more than 300,000 permanent resident applications so far this year, and are more than on track to achieve our target of 431,000 new permanent residents this year, which of course will be the largest number of newcomers that have been resettled permanently in Canada in any given year in our history. In 2021, we've processed 31% more study permits compared to 2019, and we're on track to finalize even more applications in 2022 with almost 360,000 study permits finalized between January 1st and the end of July this year. We've been taking concrete steps to reduce some of these backlogs, which, to be clear, should be distinguished from the total number of cases in our inventory. These are the cases that we're talking about that are beyond the service standard that we have broadcasted. Despite the work, we know that the wait is too long, and in many cases, we need to address it and to return to the service standard that our clients, Canada's future students, workers, permanent residents, and citizens have come to expect. To support greater transparency in our effort, we're implementing solutions like online trackers that allow some permanent residents and citizenship applicants to view the status of their applications. We're going to be expanding the use of these trackers to give people a sense of where their files are at across our system as soon as those tools are ready. We're also now publishing monthly data on our website to track our progress on reducing the backlogs in the immigration system, including the number of applications that have been completed, the number in progress, and those that are overdue, to get back to the service standard that Canadians quite rightly expect. In order to support Canada's employers who need skilled workers to fill jobs, we're doing a number of things. We're making it easier for some workers who are already here working to continue working. For example, the extension of postgraduate work permits that we announced a number of weeks ago to make it easier for up to 93,000 workers in Canada who are educated in Canada to continue to stay and to work here just when they're needed to address the labor shortage. Similarly, the reason I'm in Northern Ontario is just recently we announced an expansion to a program that will bring workers to smaller communities and northern communities with an expansion to the rural and northern immigration pilot to help address the labor shortage in smaller communities and rural areas in northern Canada. Skilled newcomers, it's no question, enrich and help diversify Canadian communities and help recruit and retrain global talent in fields like healthcare, agriculture, transportation, and the skilled trades. As our work continues, we're going to continue to share information as in the coming weeks and months that will include additional measures that are going to help improve processing, reduce backlogs, and ensure our immigration system works for everyone. It's important that we remember immigration is about people. The measures that we're putting forward are going to make it easier and faster for families to be reunited, for workers to fill jobs in Canada, and to continue to support some of the world's most vulnerable. Thank you. Merci tout le monde. I'm now happy to open up the event for questions, unless our co-chairs in the room have further to add.
Parfait. On commence avec les questions.
All right, we'll go to questions. We said we'd have 25 minutes. We hope to have the chance to ask all the questions. To answer all the questions taken by journalists, posed by journalists.
Hi. Just wanted to take a step back, because obviously this task force was created because the government was under pressure on a wide range of areas. The government was not providing basic services, right? So if this rosy news conference is a result of that, is it not time for an independent review to find out what exactly is going on here?
Thanks, Bill. Look, this isn't a rosy news conference. I think because we stated pretty clearly that we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of work to do, and in some cases we aren't up to the pre-pandemic service level that Canadians expect and deserve. This committee has resisted a number of perhaps useful desires to blame others, and there are externalities that are driving this. whether it's people wanting to come to Canada in unprecedented numbers. We're talking about crises in Ukraine, Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, whether we're talking about increased demand for passports, the resulting slow response to getting out of the pandemic, which we're still not out of, frankly, and returning the civil service to a level that Canadians expect and deserve. We could have sat here and blamed others. We could have blamed airlines. We could have blamed this, that, and the other. But we realized quite quickly that a lot of the responsibility did lie on our shoulders. And to some extent, we were slow in responding to a number of unprecedented, yes, externalities, but things that Canadians expect to see from their governments, which is Passports X delivered within a reasonable time period, visas processed for students and others in a timely fashion, people whose livelihoods depend on the government providing a very basic service to which they're entitled. There's a lot of work to be done, and looking inwards and seeing how we can get that machinery of government back up and going to a service standard, and then looking at the long term as to what we have to do to fix the problem, whether it's old systems that haven't been updated for decades, whether it is more people, more bodies. We've addressed this problem throughout the summer by doing pretty much one or two things. We've thrown bodies at the problem, which is not the most effective ways of doing things. It's important because it got people their passport in time so they could finally travel after sitting in their houses for 2 years. That is not the most effective way of, as I said, of doing things. This task force's job does not have an executive role. We make recommendations to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance through Cabinet, and that is inevitably what will result in any sort of improvements that Canadians deserve. So today we're saying there's stuff that's happened. We've worked together to fix the problem that's happening within and on our responsibility. But I don't think anyone should think that this lies entirely on the shoulders of the Canadian government, because it doesn't. There are a number of other factors that are unprecedented in nature, and we are scrambling as a government to deal with them. This is a role that no minister can do alone. We have to be working together. I think when we've been able to show the best of this government is when we've actually been worked together throughout the pandemic to solve problems which were unprecedented as well in nature. There's too often a tendency in government to work in silos, whether it's through ministers and deputy ministers, and often that results in the inefficiencies that Canadians have seen. And that is why we have met once or even twice a week to talk about these things and to address issues and call ourselves to task for the work that we need to get done. I don't know if Marcy had anything else.
I do, if I might, Bill. To characterize this as rosy, I agree with Mr. Miller. It is decidedly not that. And it is about teamwork. And the other thing that I would say, it's also about being real and honest with Canadians and bringing Canadians along in this process, letting them know step by step what is happening. We heard from the ministers this morning, Minister Alghabra, Minister Gould, Minister Fraser, step by step, and we've done that, being real and honest about that. This is not a rosy situation, but Canadians deserve the truth. They deserve to know what's happening, and they deserve to know that that we're working on this incrementally every day. We're on it.
I can just add on another topic. I'm sure you all saw the video of Krista Freeland being harassed in Alberta at a city hall. Some of your former colleagues are saying cabinet ministers should have increased security. I don't know if one or two of you could talk about your personal experiences with security and whether you think there should be changes in light of what we saw this weekend.
I said yes.
Good morning. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Marcy, if you want to take it.
Minister Mendicino, please.
Good morning. Look, knowing Deputy Prime Minister Freeland very well, she's tough as nails, but that hardly makes it right. There's absolutely no place for the kind of intimidation, harassment, and downright threats that she and her staff were subjected to. I've watched that video a number of times, and every single time it turns my stomach. It's unacceptable. We need everybody to call this out. This is not a partisan issue. And I do want to take a moment to acknowledge some of our colleagues from across the aisle who have stepped up and who have said unequivocally that this is wrong. And we need more to do that full-throatedly, without any hesitation. we're at a very sensitive juncture in our politics right now, and we need to bring the temperature down. We need to have big debates. That's one of the hallmarks of our democracy. There's no kept within the confines of what is civil. So we'll continue to make sure that we're working with all law enforcement to ensure the safety and security of all parliamentarians. But we've got to make sure that we keep it civil.
Perhaps I could jump in if that's okay. Yeah. So just, I think, Bill, to your question, we've been very lucky in Canada, and I think we've prided ourselves for many years on the fact that our politicians are generally very accessible. I often hear from people, oh, wow, like you just walk into offices and you see people in the community, and that's something that I think we want to maintain. That being said, I think those of us that have been in politics for a number of years now have also seen an increase in disturbing and threatening rhetoric, whether it be online or whether it be in person. We've seen public figures, particularly that are female, that have experienced significant harassment, both as politicians, but also as journalists. I mean, we saw that this weekend as well. And we've been seeing it for quite a while, and we've seen quite a rise in it. And things that are being said, that are being written, and in fact, that are being acted upon now in person, like the incident we witnessed with Minister Freeland over the past couple of days in Alberta, are increasing in their threatening behavior, in their threatening of violence, and in the language that is being used. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as political leaders, but also as citizens, to not accept this kind of behavior. One of the hallmarks of democracy is being able to disagree in a way that is peaceful, civil, and respectful. And you can disagree vehemently. We do it all the time in the House of Commons. We do it all the time, in public, and that's a good thing. But there's a line that shouldn't be crossed, and that kind of threatening behavior is one of those lines that should not be crossed. I can tell you that I've had to have RCMP protection in the past because of threats that were made against me. It's something that, unfortunately, I think is on the rise. I'm grateful for the fact that that protection is available to us as cabinet ministers, but I'm sad that it's something that we need. And, we've seen this across party lines in the House of Commons, in the sense that, members of Parliament are being more and more attacked online. And I think one of the things that we have to realize, it's something that I've said for a long time, is that the lines between what happens online and offline are blurred. It's not like the online world doesn't translate into reality. And we need to, as Minister Mendicino said, lower the temperature. We need to understand that most people who are involved in politics are there because they want a better future for this country. They may have different visions about how we achieve that, but that we need to find ways to see each other as fellow Canadians, not as traitors, not as, someone who's trying to undermine this country, but how we can actually look at each other on an equal level. We can find ways to disagree. We can find ways to listen to each other and to have that engagement, but we shouldn't be resorting to violence or threatening behavior. And I think that, we as Canadians need to collectively stand against that kind of behavior because it doesn't serve anyone in the end. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on. We have many reporters in the room that want to ask questions, so please respond directly to the question and maybe limit the time taken so everyone has a chance to ask a question. Prochaine question, Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Next question, Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. My question is for Minister Mendicino regarding the incident with Minister Freeland. It's very simple in Quebec. Every minister minister has a bodyguard and an armed driver, a chauffeur, in other words. Are you considering this option? Considering that there are ministers in the G7 who don't have bodyguards. Look, all options are on the table. We're working with the RCMP, with the police services and with the PPS on the Hill. This would be not only with the idea of protecting ministers, but all politicians. We understand the situation is serious, and we're continuing to assess all threats. We need to remain vigilant, but we also need to emphasize that this behavior is unacceptable. This is not just a threat to the minister and her family. This is a threat to democracy. This is not a partisan issue. Everyone must be united faced with this issue.
If you can repeat in English, one of my colleagues would need that.
Look, we'll continue to explore all options. We work very closely with the RCMP, with the Sergeant at Arms, with all of the local and regional police services who offer protection not only to ministers, but to all MPs as well as their staff when they're traveling around the country. The situation regarding security on the landscape is becoming more and more complex. We are seeing more incidents, particularly involving women, involving racialized Canadians, involving Indigenous peoples. I don't believe that that is a coincidence. And we need to be sure that people can contribute, that they can lend their voices to our politics. The threats that we see don't only impact the individuals, their families, and their teams. It represents a threat to our democracy. And if we want to continue to drive forward, we need to be able to have robust debate, but it's important that we keep that debate civil. And, I have confidence in Canadians that we're able to unite around this. This is not a partisan issue, as I said earlier. We need to really bring the temperature down and just remember that we're all trying to make the country better.
But what is preventing you, Minister Mendicino, from providing a bodyguard around the clock to ministers? Is this a disadvantage? Why are you waiting for somebody to be injured? Answered. Currently, we provide all services and support that ministers need, as well as MPs. The minister's sound has cut out. There is no audio from the minister. We can no longer hear you, Minister. We still can't hear you, Minister. Can you hear me now? We can hear you. Please go ahead. No, we still can't hear you. We'll go to another question, unfortunately. Perhaps we can come back to you later.
So next question is David Aiken, Global.
Thank you very much. And I guess perhaps a quick question for Minister Alghabra and others who might have something to say about this. You, of course, may have been paying attention to the Conservative leadership race. And one of the candidates in that race speaks a lot about gatekeepers and how he'll just eliminate gatekeepers and government will magically work better. I wonder if, you might take that a little seriously and say, are there places where government can get out of the way in terms of improving our transportation system? Minister Alghabra.
David, thank you for that question, because I actually find it ironic. On the one hand, some conservative voices are saying remove government, and then on the other, they're asking government to fix problems in the private sector. So you can't have it both ways. The reality is that the transportation sector, for the most part, is run by the private sector. And there is a role for government to ensure that there's a high standard of safety and efficiency. But from an operations perspective, the sector is responsible for delivering services and goods that they have signed the contract with their customers. We, as a government, has introduced for the first time in Canada's history a set of rules to ensure that the airlines are responsible for delivering what they promised their customers to deliver. Prior to 2017, we had no rules that ensures that airlines refund passengers if they don't deliver on their services. The private sector airlines sometimes did it, sometimes didn't. There were no consistent rules. And it was the federal government, our government, that brought together a set of rules to ensure that passengers are protected. And in fact, as of September 8th, there's going to be an improved set of rules to ensure that that passengers are further protected. So look, I'm not here to say that governments always do things right, but I'm here to say that private sector doesn't always do things right. And it's working together, the private sector, government, collaboratively, keeping in focus service of Canadians, making sure that Canadians get the service they deserve is the best way moving forward. So the partnership that we have is essential, and that there is a role for government to protect the interest of Canadians.
Thank you very much. And follow-up from Minister Gould, just on that other topic we're talking about, in the wake of the Minister Freeland confrontation, which I think everyone agreed was completely unacceptable, there has been a lot of whataboutism, and some may say, in terms of the political discourse, that there is a lot of blame to go around. Most recently, we saw your colleague Chris Biddle call Michael Geist a racist for the simple fact that Professor Geist seemed to disagree with the government's policy on something, and I know Chris Biddle apologized. But Minister Gould, I wonder what you think about that you have, and it's not the first time that, your government member has called opponents racist or misogynist when there's a disagreement, but Professor Geist's chief complaint was he'd like to know how the heck that anti-Semitic group got a grant from the Heritage Department. So I guess I have two things. Do you think you guys have been, when I say you guys, Liberals have been doing what you can to lower the temperature? And two, would you like to see the Heritage Department or Minister Hussein and his diversity minister, one or the other, figure out what the hell happened that CMAC got a government grant?
Well, first of all, David, I think Minister Hussein wants to figure that out as well, and he's been unequivocal that is completely unacceptable. And I would say that when I learned of it as well, I was extraordinarily concerned. We all have a role to play in lowering the temperature. I'm reminded of something the Prime Minister said back in 2015, where he was talking about, it's much easier to point fingers. It's much easier to go negative. It's much harder. And it requires a lot more energy and a lot more thought to be constructive. And I think, we have collectively gone through a very traumatic experience in the COVID-19 pandemic. 2 years of, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of hardship, a lot of loss. And I think we also have to on all sides, take a moment to recognize that and to understand what other people are going through who maybe share different views and different viewpoints, and to do our best to try and meet people where they are. That's a hard thing to do because there are a lot of emotions and people have gone through a lot of difficulties over the past couple of years. But I think we can all take a moment and see what happened in Alberta and say, actually, you know what, this is not the Canada that we collectively want. And so that requires those of us in government, it requires those in opposition, it requires the broader public to take a step back and say, okay, you know what, that happened. But let's figure out how we move forward in a better way, in a more constructive way. And I think that's a responsibility that we can all take on. The other thing that I would say is that there have been ideas that are spreading, that are taking hold, that are very detrimental and very concerning. And we need to find a way to engage with people who find it acceptable to use that kind of language and that kind of behavior and walk them back a bit. I don't know exactly how we do that, but it's something that I think as political leaders, we have to be very mindful of. I think it's very concerning that you have political leaders, and you referred to, I think, one of them who talks about government as gatekeepers, who talks about, getting out of the way, about, having the freest country in the world. I mean, it's a pretty free country that we live in, but we also want to be able to have it be a safe country and have it be a welcoming country, and one where people can grow and thrive in a way that is inclusive. And so I think we have a lot of work to do coming out of, these very difficult 2.5 years. And that's incumbent upon all of us. But I would also, ask that those who are doing some finger pointing right now take a step back, take a deep breath, and think about, how can I do this in a way that's going to be more constructive for my country as a whole?
David, it's Minister Mendocino. I'll just say very quickly that Laith Marouf should have never received
we have
funding.
just been listening, and we are listening to the tail end of the Task Force on Services Committee wrapping up. This committee was looking at wait times, demand for passports, delays for services. We heard from Minister Ian, this is not a uniquely Canadian problem, but we have also heard this morning from the ministers about improvements that have been made around staffing, fewer flight cancellations, people are going through Canadian airports more quickly, delays on the tarmac being reduced. As well, the issue that the ministers are being questioned about right now is security. And we heard from Minister Mendocino that all Canadians need to stand up to what happened against the sort of thing that happened with Chrystia Freeland, saying that this is not a partisan issue. And there are questions being raised as well about whether or not there should be more security for ministers. If you haven't seen the video or heard the story, she was harassed, verbally assaulted by someone in Alberta.